U Zagrebu milijunaš vidi bivšu ženu, čistačicu, kako prodaje vafle s trojkama istima njemu. The spring morning in Zagreb carried the sweet aroma of vanilla and warm dough that mixed with the fresh air descending from Medvednica mountain. Near Ban Jelačić Square, a small waffle stand attracted hurried students and families walking to work. Behind the counter, Ana Radić wore a simple apron, her hair tied back, serving treats with a quiet smile that had learned to hide years of struggle. Life had been hard on her, but she faced it with the dignity her grandmother always said came from within. "Slowly but surely you reach far," she whispered to herself each morning, the old Croatian saying giving her strength. The waffle iron hissed as she poured batter, the sound mixing with the distant rumble of Zagreb's blue trams and the chatter of early customers. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, flipping golden waffles and dusting them with powdered sugar. The small stand, wedged between a flower shop and a cafe, was her world now. She had built this life from nothing, one waffle at a time, proving that even when life knocks you down, you can still rise. The morning sun caught the steam rising from her little kitchen, creating small rainbows in the air. That peaceful rhythm shattered when a sleek black BMW pulled up directly in front of her stand. The engine purred to a stop, and from behind tinted windows emerged a figure that made Anna's blood freeze in her veins. Luka Horvat stepped onto the cobblestones, his handmade Italian shoes clicking against the stone with the confidence of a man who owned half of Zagreb's skyline. His tailored charcoal suit probably cost more than Anna made in 3 months, and his platinum watch caught the morning light like a beacon of wealth. But it was his face that stopped her heart. Older now, more lined around the eyes, but unmistakably the man who had walked out of her life 8 years ago. He moved with that same arrogant stride, scanning the street like he was surveying his kingdom. The scent of his expensive cologne drifted toward her stand, mixing strangely with the humble smell of batter and sugar. Anna's hands trembled as she gripped the counter, forcing herself to breathe. "Who digs a hole for others falls into it himself," her mother used to say, and she wondered if this moment was proof of that old wisdom. "Priđe nego, što nastavimo s ovom nevjerojatnom pričom? Reci nam, iz koje nas zemlje gledaš? Ostavi komentar i klikni na gumb hype ili like kako bi ovaj video došao do još više ljudi. Pretplati se na kanal, ne smiješ propustiti sutrašnju priču. A sada, ajdemo dalje." Luka's eyes swept across the square with the casual indifference of a man accustomed to owning everything he saw. His real estate empire had made him one of Croatia's youngest billionaires, with luxury hotels from Dubrovnik to Rovinj bearing his name. He was here for a business meeting at the nearby hotel, but something made him pause at the waffle stand. Maybe it was the familiar laugh echoing from behind the counter, or perhaps the way the morning light fell across a woman's profile that stirred memories he thought he'd buried. As his gaze focused on the figure serving customers, recognition hit him like a physical blow. Anna, his ex-wife, the woman he'd discarded like an old business contract when her simple dreams became inconvenient to his ambitions. She looked older, worn by years of struggle he'd never bothered to imagine. Her clothes were clean but faded, her hands roughened by work, yet there was something in her posture that spoke of quiet strength. The sight of her there, reduced to selling street food, should have satisfied the cruel part of him that had always needed to win. Instead, it made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. But then he saw them, and his world tilted off its axis completely. 3 boys, maybe 7 years old, emerged from behind the stand carrying small boxes of supplies. They moved in perfect synchronization, their dark hair catching the light exactly like his own, their facial features unmistakably familiar. The oldest carried himself with a confidence that reminded Luka of his own childhood photos, while the middle boy had that same thoughtful expression Luka wore during business meetings. The youngest laughed with abandon, his eyes bright with the kind of joy Luka had forgotten existed. They were identical to him. Not just similar, but like looking at 3 versions of himself at that age. His knees nearly buckled as the truth crashed over him like a wave from the Adriatic. These were his sons, his children, the family he never knew existed, working beside their mother at a humble waffle stand while he lived in luxury just across the city. The boys chatted in Croatian, their voices carrying the musical accent of Zagreb, completely unaware that their father was watching them from 10 feet away. Anna noticed his presence before the boys did, her face going pale as their eyes met across the narrow street. For a moment neither moved, frozen in a tableau of shock and recognition that felt like it could last forever. She straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin with the dignity she'd learned to wear like armor. Better a sparrow in hand than a dove on the branch, she thought, remembering her grandmother's words about appreciating what you have. She had these beautiful children, this honest work, this peaceful life. She didn't need his approval or his pity, but Luca saw the flash of fear in her eyes, the way her hands instinctively moved to shield the boys from his view. It was the look of a mother protecting her cubs, and it hit him harder than any business rival ever had. The morning air suddenly felt thick and heavy, charged with 8 years of unspoken words and unanswered questions. Other customers continued to order waffles, oblivious to the drama unfolding before them. Life in Zagreb's old town continued its rhythm, while 2 former lovers stood paralyzed by the weight of secrets finally exposed. The eldest boy looked up from his box and noticed the well-dressed stranger staring at their stand. With the innocent curiosity of childhood, he tugged on Anna's apron and pointed toward Luca. "Mama, who is that man? He's been watching us for a long time." His Croatian words carried clearly across the small space, and Anna's throat tightened as she searched for an answer that wouldn't shatter their peaceful world. The boy's eyes were so much like Luca's that she wondered how no one else had ever noticed the resemblance. She could see confusion growing on her son's face as the silence stretched too long. "Just a customer, sweetheart. Keep helping your brothers," she managed to whisper, her voice barely steady. But the boy continued to stare, as if some instinct told him this stranger was important. Luca found himself unable to look away from the child's face. His own features reflected back at him with an innocence he'd never possessed. The realization that he'd missed 8 years of their lives hit him like a physical pain, a hollow ache that no amount of money could fill. Luca's phone buzzed with messages from his assistant about the morning's meetings, but for the first time in decades, business seemed utterly meaningless. His empire of concrete and steel felt like toys compared to the flesh and blood standing before him. He watched as Anna gently guided the boys back to their tasks, her movements efficient but protective. She had raised them alone, he realized, through their first steps, first words, first days of school. She had been both mother and father, while he sealed deals and counted profits. The boys moved with practiced ease around the small workspace, clearly accustomed to helping with the family business. They shared jokes in the way only siblings could, their laughter creating a warm bubble of happiness around the humble stand. Customers smiled as they served them, charmed by the 3 identical boys who worked with such cheerful dedication. It was a picture of simple contentment that Luca's wealth had never been able to buy. The irony wasn't lost on him. While he'd been building an empire, she'd been building something infinitely more valuable. The middle child approached a customer with a fresh waffle, speaking polite Croatian with the careful pronunciation Anna had obviously taught him. "Here you are, sir. My mama makes the best waffles in all of Zagreb." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and the customer chuckled at the boy's confident declaration. Luca watched, transfixed, as his son, counted change with careful concentration, his small tongue poking out slightly in focus exactly as Luca had done as a child. The resemblance was so strong it was almost comical, yet it filled him with a profound sadness. These children didn't know they had a father. They thought their mother's strength was all they needed, and perhaps they were right. Anna had clearly done an extraordinary job raising them, instilling them with values he'd forgotten he once possessed. They were polite, hard-working, and genuinely happy, everything his privileged upbringing had failed to make him. The youngest boy dropped a napkin and immediately bent to pick it up without being asked, the simple gesture speaking volumes about the character Anna had built in them. Anna's hands shook slightly as she prepared another batch of batter, hyper-aware of Luca's continued presence but forcing herself to maintain normalcy for the children's sake. She could feel his eyes on her family like a weight, studying every detail of the life she'd built without him. Part of her wanted to confront him, to demand explanations for his abandonment, but a larger part just wanted him to leave before the boys started asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. The wolf is satiated, and the goat is whole, she thought, remembering the old saying about impossible situations. How could she protect her children's innocence while facing the man who had caused her so much pain? The morning rush was picking up, and she needed to focus on her customers, but every nerve in her body was aware of Luca's presence. She wondered what he saw when he looked at them. A successful businessman slumming with street vendors, or something else entirely. The thought that he might try to claim some role in their lives after all these years made her stomach turn with anxiety. Other vendors in the square began to notice the expensive car parked awkwardly near Anna's stand, and the well-dressed man who seemed frozen in place beside it. Zagreb's old town was a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business, and Anna could already feel curious glances from neighboring stalls. Mrs. Kovac from the flower shop kept craning her neck to get a better look, while Marco from the coffee cart had stopped serving customers to stare openly at the scene. Anna knew that by evening, the entire square would be buzzing with speculation about the mysterious wealthy man who'd appeared at her humble waffle stand. The attention made her skin crawl with embarrassment, but she couldn't abandon her livelihood just because her past had decided to show up uninvited. She served each customer with forced normalcy, accepting their coins with hands that trembled only slightly, praying that Luca would simply get back in his car and disappear as suddenly as he'd come. But he remained motionless, like a statue carved from guilt and shock, unable to move forward or retreat from the confrontation with his abandoned family. Mala pauza u priči. Želim te pitati, što misliš o ovome? Napiši u komentarima. Ne zaboravi kliknuti na gumb, hype ili like kako bi ova priča dosegla više ljudi i pretplati se na kanal jer te sutra čeka nova priča. A sada nastavljamo. Days passed like a slow torture for Luca, each morning finding him parked across from Anna's waffle stand, watching his sons through tinted windows like some kind of stalker. He told himself he was just trying to understand the situation, to process the magnitude of what he'd discovered. But the truth was simpler and more painful. He was addicted to watching them live their lives without him. The boys arrived each morning at 7, their backpacks bouncing as they ran to help their mother set up the stand. They worked with the kind of enthusiasm that only children possessed, turning mundane tasks into games and adventures. The eldest, who seemed to be the natural leader, would direct his brothers in organizing supplies while Anna prepared the first batch of batter. Their laughter echoed across the square, a sound so pure it made Luca's chest ache with longing. He found himself memorizing their faces, the way they moved, their individual quirks and personalities. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, he thought bitterly, seeing his own stubborn streak in the eldest boy's determination to do everything perfectly. Anna noticed the black BMW returning each day, always parked in the same spot, always with the same solitary figure behind the wheel. At first she tried to ignore it, focusing on her work and her children, but the constant surveillance made her increasingly uncomfortable. She began looking over her shoulder, jumping at unexpected sounds, and her usually steady hands grew clumsy with anxiety. The boys started asking why she seemed so nervous, why she kept glancing toward the parked car, and she struggled to find answers that wouldn't frighten them. "Every pot finds its lid," she muttered under her breath, an old Croatian saying that suggested everyone eventually faced their destiny. But she'd thought her destiny with Luca was finished years ago when he chose his ambitions over their marriage. Now his presence loomed over her small world like a dark cloud, threatening the peace she'd worked so hard to build. She considered moving the stand to another location, but this corner had taken months to establish, and starting over somewhere else would mean financial disaster. On the 5th day of his silent vigil, Luca finally gathered the courage to approach the stand. He walked across the square with the measured steps of a man going to his execution, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. The boys looked up as his shadow fell across their workspace, 3 pairs of dark eyes studying him with innocent curiosity. "Good morning," he said in Croatian, his voice rougher than intended. "Could I have a waffle, please?" Anna's face went pale, but she nodded curtly and began preparing his order with mechanical precision. The oldest boy stepped forward with the confidence of a natural businessman, quoting the price and asking if he wanted any toppings. Luca found himself speechless, staring into eyes that were mirror images of his own, seeing the intelligence and determination he recognized from his own childhood. "With powdered sugar," he managed to whisper, his throat tight with emotion. The boy nodded seriously and began dusting the waffle with careful attention to detail. The same perfectionist streak that had made Luca successful in business, now evident in his 7-year-old son. "Are you new to Zagreb?" the middle boy asked with genuine interest, his head tilted in a gesture so familiar that Luca nearly gasped. "You have a very nice car. Are you a businessman?" The innocent question hit Luca like a physical blow, highlighting the vast distance between his world and theirs. Here was his son, admiring the very symbols of success that had cost Luca his family in the first place. He wanted to explain everything, to tell them who he was and why he'd been watching them. But Anna's warning glare kept him silent. "Yes," he said finally, "I work in the city." The boy nodded sagely, as if this explained everything, then returned to helping his brothers. They moved around each other with practiced ease, a well-oiled team that had clearly learned to depend on each other. Luca realized with a sharp pang that they'd grown up believing they only had each other and their mother. They'd learned independence and cooperation out of necessity, developing strengths he'd never needed to cultivate in his privileged childhood. Anna handed him the waffle with barely controlled anger, her fingers brushing his briefly as she took his money. The contact sent electricity through both of them, memories of better times crackling in the space between their hands. "Enjoy," she said coldly, the word dripping with irony. She remembered how he used to love her simple cooking, how he'd praised her humble meals before his tastes grew expensive and sophisticated. Now he stood there in his €1,000 suit, eating a waffle that cost less than his morning coffee, and she wondered what cruel twist of fate had brought him back into their lives. Every dog has its day, she thought, an old saying her grandmother had used when talking about justice and karma. Perhaps this was Luca's day to finally see what he'd thrown away, but she couldn't afford to let sentiment cloud her judgment. These children were her priority, and she would protect them from disappointment and abandonment at any cost. Luca bit into the waffle and was surprised by its perfection, light and crispy outside, tender inside with just the right amount of sweetness. It was better than anything served in his 5-star hotels, made with the kind of care and attention that money couldn't buy. "This is delicious," he said, and meant it. The youngest boy beamed with pride, bouncing on his toes with excitement. "Mama is the best cook in all of Croatia," he declared, his enthusiasm infectious. She learned from her grandmother, who learned from her grandmother. "It's a family secret." The other boys nodded in agreement, their loyalty to their mother absolute and touching. Luca felt a stab of jealousy at their devotion, wondering if he would ever earn even a fraction of such love from them. They spoke about Anna, with the kind of reverence usually reserved for heroes, completely unaware that the man standing before them should have been sharing in their pride. Their simple faith in their mother's abilities made his business achievements feel hollow and meaningless. The next morning, Luca returned with a different approach. This time he brought flowers for Anna, not the expensive orchids from his usual florist, but simple daisies from Mrs. Kovac's nearby stand. The boys were charmed by the gesture, clustering around to admire the bouquet and asking if he was Anna's boyfriend. Anna's face burned with embarrassment and anger as she accepted the flowers with gritted teeth, unable to refuse them without seeming rude in front of her children. "Thank you," she said stiffly, "but it's not necessary." Luca could see the warning in her eyes, the silent plea to leave them alone, but he couldn't stop himself from coming back. Every day brought a new small gift, pastries from a fancy bakery, colored pencils for the boys, a warm scarf when the weather turned cold. The children began to look forward to his visits, greeting him with genuine warmth that made Anna's stomach churn with worry. She knew she should put a stop to it, but how could she explain without revealing the truth? The regular customers at the square began to notice the daily ritual, and gossip spread like wildfire through Zagreb's tight-knit community. Mrs. Kovac whispered to anyone who would listen about the mysterious wealthy man courting the waffle lady, while Marco from the coffee cart speculated about whether Anna had found herself a rich boyfriend. The attention made Anna increasingly uncomfortable, especially when well-meaning neighbors started offering advice about landing a wealthy husband. "Strike while the iron is hot," Mrs. Petrovich from the fruit stand advised with a knowing wink. "A man like that doesn't come around twice in a lifetime." If only they knew, Anna thought bitterly. The irony of their encouragement was almost laughable. If only they realized she was being courted by the very man who had abandoned her when she needed him most. The boys, oblivious to the adult undercurrents, simply enjoyed the attention and gifts, their innocent happiness a constant reminder of what was at stake. Luca's business began to suffer, as his obsession with the waffle stand consumed more of his time and energy. Important meetings were postponed, deals fell through, and his assistant grew increasingly frustrated with his distracted behavior. But none of it seemed to matter anymore. The empire he'd built felt like a house of cards compared to the solid foundation Anna had created with their children. He started bringing his laptop to a nearby cafe so he could work while keeping an eye on the stand, conducting million-euro negotiations while watching his sons play during their breaks. The contrast was surreal, discussing international real estate deals while his heart broke over missing bedtime stories and scraped knees. His business partners began to worry about his reliability, whispering about whether the stress of success was finally getting to him. Little did they know that he was discovering what success really meant, and it had nothing to do with profit margins or quarterly reports. 2 weeks into his daily visits, Luca overheard a conversation that stopped him cold. A social worker had approached Anna about irregularities in the boys' school enrollment, specifically the absence of father information on their records. "It's just a formality," the woman explained, "but the school needs complete documentation for their files. If the father is unknown or absent, we need official acknowledgement of single-parent status." Anna's face went white as she fumbled for explanations, her voice shaking as she promised to provide the necessary paperwork. The boys listened with confusion, asking questions their mother couldn't answer without revealing secrets she'd kept buried for 8 years. Luca watched from his usual observation point, his hands clenched into fists as he realized the complications his absence had created. These children had no legal father, no financial security beyond their mother's small business, no safety net if something happened to Anna. The responsibility hit him like an avalanche, crushing and undeniable. That evening, Luca did something he hadn't done in years. He called his mother. Maria Horvat had always been the moral compass of their family, the one who reminded him of values beyond material success. "Mama," he said, his voice breaking like a child's, "I've made a terrible mistake." He told her everything. About Anna, about the divorce, about the children he'd never known existed. His mother listened in silence, her breathing the only sound on the other end of the line. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "The tree is known by its fruit," she said finally, using an old Croatian proverb. "What kind of tree have you been, Luca? And what fruit do you want to bear now?" Her words cut deeper than any business rival's insults ever had. He'd spent years proving his worth through acquisitions and achievements, but he'd failed at the most basic human responsibility, being a father to his children. The next day brought a new crisis that would test everyone's resolve. A city inspector arrived at Anna's stand, clipboard in hand, citing complaints about unlicensed food service and improper permits. Anna's face crumpled as she realized someone had reported her, probably a jealous competitor who resented her success. The inspector was thorough and unsympathetic, finding minor violations that could shut down her business permanently. The boys watched in confusion as their mother argued desperately with the official, their young faces reflecting her distress. "We need this job," Anna pleaded, her voice breaking. "This is how we survive. Please, I can fix whatever's wrong." But the inspector was unmoved, threatening massive fines that would bankrupt her small operation. From his observation point, Luca felt a rage unlike anything he'd experienced in business. Someone was attacking his family. Yes, he finally admitted to himself, his family. And every instinct screamed at him to intervene. But he knew that revealing his connection to them might make things worse, not better. Anna spent that night hunched over paperwork, trying to navigate bureaucratic requirements she couldn't afford to meet. The boys, sensing their mother's distress, offered to help with their limited understanding of adult problems. "We can sell our toys," the youngest suggested earnestly, "or I can get a job delivering newspapers." Their innocent willingness to sacrifice for the family broke Anna's heart and strengthened her resolve simultaneously. She would find a way to save their livelihood, with or without help from anyone. "God helps those who help themselves," she whispered, repeating her grandmother's favorite saying as she worked late into the night. The irony wasn't lost on her that the man who could solve all her problems with a single phone call was probably sleeping peacefully in his luxury penthouse, oblivious to the crisis his reappearance had somehow triggered. She refused to even consider asking for his help, knowing that accepting anything from Luca would mean giving him power over their lives once again. The following morning, Anna's stand remained closed, official notices taped to its small windows like funeral flowers. The boys stood beside her in confused silence, their routine shattered, their security threatened. Regular customers approached with concern, asking when she would reopen. expressing genuine affection for the family that had become part of their daily lives. Mrs. Kovac offered to help with the paperwork, while Marco suggested starting a petition to support local businesses. Their kindness was overwhelming, but Anna knew that good intentions wouldn't pay the fines or satisfy the bureaucratic requirements. She felt trapped between pride and desperation, watching her carefully built life crumble, while the father of her children observed from a distance like some kind of voyeur. The fox mourns for the chickens, she thought bitterly, remembering how her grandmother described people who caused problems, then pretended to care about the consequences. Luca watched the scene unfold with growing anguish, his business instincts warring with his newfound emotional awareness. Every fiber of his being wanted to stride across the square, write a check, make phone calls, and solve the problem with the efficiency that had made him successful. But he knew that Anna would reject any help that came with strings attached, and he had no right to force his solutions on her life. Meanwhile, his sons, he was finally allowing himself to think of them that way, stood beside their mother with a dignity that broke his heart. They didn't cry or complain, but their small faces reflected a maturity that children shouldn't need to possess. The eldest put his arm around his mother's shoulders in a gesture of comfort that reminded Luca painfully of his own father's support during difficult times. These boys were learning life lessons he'd never had to face, developing character through hardship while he'd been handed everything on a silver platter. That afternoon, as Anna walked the boys home from their closed stand, Luca finally made a decision that terrified him more than any business deal ever had. He parked his car and approached them on foot, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. "Anna," he called softly, and she turned with the wary expression of a cornered animal. The boys looked between the adults, sensing tension they couldn't understand. "We need to talk," Luca said simply. "Please, just 5 minutes." Anna's jaw tightened, but she nodded curtly and told the boys to wait by the fountain while she spoke with the man. They walked a few steps away, close enough for Anna to keep an eye on her children, but far enough for privacy. "I know about the permits," Luca said quietly. "I can help." Anna's eyes flashed with anger and something that might have been betrayal. "I don't want your help," she said fiercely. "I don't want anything from you. You gave up that right 8 years ago when you walked away from our marriage." Luca's voice broke as he faced Anna's fierce rejection, but instead of arguing, he did something that shocked them both. He knelt down on the cobblestones of Ban Jelicic Square, his expensive suit forgotten, his pride abandoned. "You're right," he whispered, tears streaming down his face for the first time since childhood. "I gave up that right. I was a coward who chose money over love, business over family. But those boys, our boys, they deserve better than watching their mother struggle because of my failures." He pulled out a folder from his jacket, documents he'd spent the night preparing. "I've transferred ownership of 3 of my buildings to you, not as charity, not as guilt money, but as what I should have provided 8 years ago. Child support, a father's responsibility." Anna stared at the papers in shock, seeing property deeds worth millions of euros, enough to secure their children's future forever. "The bird that flies alone has no one to sing to," Luca said, using an old Croatian saying his grandmother had taught him. "I've been flying alone for 8 years, and I'm tired of the silence. I don't want forgiveness I haven't earned, but I want them to know they have a father who will never abandon them again." The oldest boy, unable to contain his curiosity any longer, broke away from his brothers and ran to where his mother stood frozen in shock. "Mama, why is the nice man crying? Did we do something wrong?" he asked, his innocent concern cutting through the adult's emotional standoff like a knife. Luca looked down at his son, truly looked at him, seeing not just his own features but Anna's gentle spirit, her strength, her capacity for love. "No, little one," Luca said softly in Croatian, his voice steady despite his tears. "You didn't do anything wrong. You're perfect. All 3 of you are perfect." The boy studied Luca's face with the intense focus children reserve for important moments, and something clicked in his young mind. "You have the same eyes as us," he said wonderingly, "and the same nose. Are you our Tata?" The question hung in the air like morning mist over the Sava River, simple and devastating in its directness. Anna's breath caught as she realized the moment of truth had arrived, not through careful planning, but through a child's innocent observation. "Yes," Luca said, his voice breaking again, "I'm your father, And I'm sorry it took me so long to find the courage to tell you." The other two boys ran over, drawn by their brother's discovery, and suddenly Luca found himself surrounded by 3 small faces staring up at him with a mixture of wonder, confusion, and hope. "Where have you been?" the middle boy asked with the directness only children possessed. "Why didn't you live with us?" The youngest, ever the optimist, simply grabbed Luca's hand and declared, "Now you can help Mama with the waffles." Their acceptance was so immediate, so unconditional, that it left both adults speechless. Anna watched through tears as her children, their children, began chattering excitedly about having a father, asking questions faster than anyone could answer, already planning how to introduce him to their friends at school. "Children and fools tell the truth," she thought, remembering another old saying, and realized that perhaps it was time to stop protecting them from a truth that might actually heal them all. Luca gathered his sons into an awkward but heartfelt embrace, feeling pieces of his soul clicking back into place after years of emptiness. "I can't undo the past," he told them seriously, "but I promise you'll never doubt that you're loved again." 6 months later, the corner near Banjelacic Square had been transformed. Where Anna's small waffle stand once struggled for permits, now stood Anna's family kitchen, a proper cafe with her name in elegant letters across the window. Inside, 3 boys did their homework at corner tables, while their mother cooked and their father, still awkward but learning, helped serve customers who had become like extended family. The walls were covered with photos of the boys growing up, gaps where Luca should have been now filled with new memories they were creating together. Luca had kept his promise about the buildings, but more importantly, he'd kept his promise about being present. He arrived every morning at 7, not in a BMW but on foot, ready to help with whatever needed doing. Anna watched him struggle to braid their daughter's hair. Yes, they'd been blessed with a little girl who had arrived like a gift 8 months after their reunion, and smiled at how much he'd changed. "Better late than never," she murmured, using the Croatian saying that had become their family motto. They weren't the same people who had married young and divorced bitter, but perhaps that was exactly what their children needed. Parents who had learned that love was worth more than pride, and that family was the only success that truly mattered. Ako te ova priča dirnula ili navela na razmišljanje, klikni na gumb hype ili like i napiši u komentarima što je na tebe ostavilo najveći dojam. Želimo čuti tvoje mišljenje. Ne zaboravi se pretplatiti na kanal. Hvala ti. I vidimo se u sljedećoj priči.